What up, psych nerds? Welcome back to Planting Thoughts, the show where we dig into the psychological soil beneath human behavior and see what's really growing down there.
And remember, we're no longer just in your ears, we're in your eyes. This is our second ever episode now on YouTube.
Yep, so if you want to see my face trying not to look too intense while talking about psychopathy, or Manon giving me the side eye when I get carried away, head to YouTube and subscribe. And if you haven't subscribed or followed Spotify, what's wrong with you?
We'll be doing these video episodes from here on out, so hit the bell if you want to get notified when we drop something new.
In the latest episode, Manon and I delved into our favorite films, sharing personal insights and why these movies resonate with us. I talked about timeless impact of The Shawshank Redemption, the imaginative narrative of The Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, and the quirky charm of The Big Lebowski. Manon highlighted the dark humor and family dynamics in The Addams Family, the gothic allure of The Interview with the Vampire, and the vibrant spectacle of the Moulin Rouge. Together, we explored how these films have left a lasting impression on our lives and continue to inspire us. If you missed it, make sure to catch up. Now, today, we're diving into one of the most haunting and most misunderstood areas of psychology, psychopathy.
Are some people born to deceive, to hurt others without remorse? Can a brain be wired for manipulation and charm without empathy?
Yeah, we're going to explore what makes a psychopath different from the other mental conditions and how these traits evolve, what serial killers can teach us really about the extreme end of the spectrum.
And if you stick around to the end, we'll be sharing our actual scores that we got on the psychopathy test. Trust me, you'll be shocked by the results.
You indeed will. All right, lock your doors, ladies and gents. It's time to plant some dark thoughts. Now, let's start with the basics. Psychopathy isn't an official diagnosis. It's not even in the DSM-5.
Really?
Yeah, that would be antisocial personality disorder, or ASPD. But psychopathy digs a little bit deeper.
Psychopathy includes affective and interpersonal traits like superficial charm, lack of empathy, and manipulativeness, along with emotional coldness.
Yeah, it really does. And the emotional coldness, I think, is really what sets psychopathy apart from a lot of these other sort of disorders. The gold standard really still is the Hare Psychology Checklist Revised. It's scored by trained professionals, and if you get a score of about 30 to 40 in North America, this is considered psychopathic.
Okay, so let's be honest. How many traits are we allowed to have before we get worried?
And we did take this at the very end of the episode, so we're going to share our scores, and it's kind of freaky. But there was this great meta-analysis done by Monstrous, and it basically supported that the PLCR had really strong predictive power about future criminal behavior and recidivism.
Okay, yeah. So, and not all psychopaths are actually violent, but if they are, think Ted Bundy. He's manipulative, unemotional, and terrifyingly calculated.
Absolutely. And there's that word manipulative and unemotional again, right? These things really tend to stand out with psychopaths. And you compare that to like Jeff Dahmer, and he may have been more compulsively driven, maybe emotionally disturbed, but not really your classic psychopath, I don't think.
So let's head into the hardware. When we talk about psychopaths, we're not just talking about personality traits. There are real measurable differences in the brain structure and function.
Right, absolutely. And one of the most consistently found abnormalities is in the amygdala. And we've talked about this before. It's our emotional sort of processing hub, right? And studies by Keel in 2006 showed that psychopaths tend to have lower activation in the amygdala and reduced amygdala volume. This is the part of the brain, again, that helps us recognize fear in others, process emotional cues, experience empathy. And if it's underdeveloped, that could explain the hallmark lack of fear, guilt, and remorse that we see in psychopathy. And it's not just about the size. Functionality matters. The prefrontal cortex, specifically the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, plays a huge role in controlling impulses and making moral decisions. In psychopaths, this part is underactive, deregulated. So it leads to poor judgment, risky behavior, antisocial behavior.
Exactly. What's even more compelling is research by Motzkin and colleagues in 2011, which found a weaker connectivity between the amygdala and the PFC. I think of it like the emotional part of the brain and the rational decision-making part not communicating properly. So they might intellectually understand what pain is or even that their actions are wrong, but emotionally, they don't care.
Yeah, and on a chemical level, things are just as bad, right? I mean, they're just as off. Psychopaths psychopaths often have lower levels of serotonin, which has been linked to increased aggression, impulsivity, right? Add that to altered dopamine function, and you get this reward system that's hypersensitive to thrills, basically. They chase stimulation like an addiction. According to research conducted by Buchholz and colleagues in 2010, this pattern is associated with a propensity for risk-taking and sensation-seeking behavior.
So it's a triple threat: poor emotional regulation, impaired moral reasoning, and supercharged reward systems.
Yeah, so basically their moral GPS is disconnected and the reward system's flooring the gas, really. It's like handing the wheel to a thrill seeker with no brakes.
And it's worth pointing out, these aren't just random quirks. These neurological differences might explain why traditional punishment or rehabilitation strategies often fall flat with psychopathic individuals.
Yeah, right. You can't really appeal to a sense of guilt if there isn't one. Now, why would nature preserve something so destructive? That's where life history theory comes in.
Some individuals develop fast life strategies, so they're prioritizing short-term goals and gains. So impulsivity and exploitation. It's not broken, it's adaptive for harsh environments.
Okay. So yeah. And there was also this thing called the cheater theory, and it proposed that psychopathy actually evolved as a social niche, right? It was an exploitive strategy, right, to thrive without cooperating. And I guess in some scenarios that might make sense. You know, we have sort of like evolved past that, it feels like, in society now.
And there were twin studies like those by Glenn and Clint in 2007 that suggest a moderate to high genetic component. So it's not destiny, but environment still matters.
Absolutely, yeah. Nature loads the gun, right? The environment pulls the trigger. Now, let's get one thing clear. Psychopathy doesn't just appear in adulthood like some kind of, cool villain origin story. A lot of these traits emerge early in life, and they often show a developmental pathway that can be tracked.
That's where callous-unemotional traits come in. We're talking about children who consistently show a lack of empathy, guilt, or emotional expression, even in situations where most kids would react with distress or remorse. Okay. These aren't just moody phases or acting out. CU traits are considered early markers of potential psychopathy.
Okay, and CU trait, that's like callous-unemotional. So some studies by Frick and White in 2008, they showed that these CU traits in childhood are strongly predictive of adult psychopathy, especially when combined with the conduct problems, right? Things like aggression, lying, defying rules. It's a dangerous blend of coldness and rule breaking that really sets the foundation for these guys.
And it's not just environmental. Genetics do play a huge part in this. Absolutely. In fact, Vidding et al. 2005 conducted twin studies again and found up to 60% of the variances in CU traits could be attributed to heritable factors.
Wow.
So that doesn't mean it's deterministic, but it does suggest a strong biological component in how these traits develop.
Yeah. And it goes deeper, right? They showed brain imaging studies in children with CU traits, and they found reduced amygdala responsiveness in children as well, especially to fearful or sad facial expressions. So they're just really not picking up on those sort of those cues that most people sort of do pick up on. And what's similar is that we see this in adult psychopathy as well, this kind of emotional blindness to the distress of others. And they showed this in other studies as well. It
still matters. Kids with a genetic predisposition are far more at risk for being raised in chaotic, neglectful, or abusive homes. But on the flip side, a structured, supportive environment can sometimes buffer these risks. That's where the intervention kind of comes in.
Yeah, absolutely. Good parenting really matters. And one of the most promising approaches is actually early behavioral therapy, especially those targeting like parenting techniques, right? Hawes and their team in 2014 showed that parent training programs where parents learn consistent, warm, and structured ways to manage behavior can actually reduce CU traits in young kids.
And those would include things like positive reinforcement, clear consequences, and emotionally responsive parenting.
Right.
The idea is while the child might not be naturally wired to feel guilt, they can still learn pro-social behavior through structure and consistency.
It's almost like we should teach these things in school, to be honest.
Definitely.
I'm not sure all parents are doing that, but here's the takeaway. Early detection matters. If we can identify these CU traits and act before those patterns solidify, there's a real chance to change the trajectory of these kids' lives.
And it's not just about labeling children as mini psychopaths. It's about recognizing red flags and using science-backed strategies to intervene while the brain is still highly malleable.
Okay. Well, and because once adulthood hits, that window starts to narrow fast. Is that what we're looking at?
Oh, yeah, definitely. You have to kind of get in there early. So if you see someone hurting a dog or something like that, you need to kind of quell that behavior before it turns into something much bigger.
Okay.
And let's clear up some confusion. Psychopathy isn't autism or schizoid personality or narcissism.
True. Simon Baron-Cohen's work on the empathy circuit showed that autistic people struggle with understanding others' emotions, but often feel deeply themselves.
Psychopaths, flip that. They understand emotions, but they don't feel them. That's the chilling part.
That is chilling. Schizoids, meanwhile, withdraw emotionally, right? They're not predatory, generally speaking. Not always, right? They're just detached.
A narcissistic personality disorder might overlap with traits like grandiosity or the lack of empathy, but not necessarily the criminality or the emotional coldness. Okay, let's dig into one of our cases, BTK. Ooh. He was the man who sits in the pew next to you, handed out citations as a city worker, led church meetings, and loved his family. But behind this mask of normalcy was a mind as twisted as his signature: bind, torture, kill. Dennis Rader was born in Pittsburgh, Kansas, which is not far from where I'm from, actually, in 1945. His mother, Dorothea May, was a bookkeeper, and his father, William, worked for Kansas Gas Services. They worked really long hours, and Dennis was often left to care for his younger 3 siblings. From an early age, there were signs that something was not quite right with Dennis, but since his parents barely paid attention to him, these went under the radar. Yeah. He harbored dark, sadistic fantasies about torturing trapped and helpless women and showed signs of zoosadism, so he was often torturing small animals and would hang them until they died.
Yeah, a common trait of a lot of psychopaths, actually.
Oh, yeah, definitely. You see that a lot throughout all of these like kind of true crime cases that we see. He began acting out sexual fantasies like voyeurism, autoerotic asphyxiation, and cross-dressing, and he would later say that it was common for him to spy on the neighbors in his neighborhood while dressed in women's clothing. And he would often steal their underwear and wear them.
Okay.
So after he graduated from high school, he attended Kansas Wesleyan University, where his grades were mediocre at best, before he dropped out after only 1 year.
Wait, all serial killers are not like extremely smart like Ed Kemper?
Oh, no, they're not all super geniuses that can manipulate the police.
Okay.
He joined the U.S. Air Force and was enlisted from 1966 till 1970. So after he was discharged, he moved to Wichita, Kansas, which is where I was born, and worked as a butcher at IGA, which is the grocery store there. And that's where his mother actually worked as a bookkeeper.
Okay.
So he married in 1971 and had 2 children, and he earned an associate's degree in electronics engineering, which is a little impressive, from Butler Community College. And then he also got his bachelor's degree in administration of justice from Wichita State University. His career included positions at notable companies like the Coleman Company, which is an outdoor supply company. You probably have like one of those like Coleman Lancers or something like that.
Absolutely. The green with the little white,
Exactly. And Cessna Aviation, which is a private jet company. From 1974 to 1988, he was employed by ADT Security Systems, and he provided security solutions to homeowners who were actually trying to protect themselves from him. In 1991, he became a dog catcher and a compliance officer in Park City, where he was known for his overzealous and strict enforcement. He allegedly would harass single women and was involved in questionable actions, such as killing a neighbor's dog with no reason. Outside work, he served as the president of his church council, was a Cub Scout leader, and was known for stalking women in Wichita.
Okay.
January 15th, 1974, the Otero family was busy getting their children ready for school. While they hustled to get their 5 children out the door, Rader was busy scaling a fence and cutting their phone lines. He'd been stalking the mother, Julie, for 2 to 3 weeks after seeing her drop her children off at school. He stalked her for these 2 or 3 weeks and attempted to learn her schedule, which was ultimately changed that morning. Okay. Joseph Jr., their son, was 9 years old. He went out to let the family dog outside when Rader, armed with a gun, forced his way into the home. Joseph Sr. and Julie believed this was a prank at first, but they were quickly assured that it wasn't, and that the 22 hollow point pistol was loaded.
That'd be some prank.
Right? Rader led the family into a bedroom where he bound them each with rope, a key part of his fantasies. And the family complained of circulation issues, and Joseph Sr. had actually cracked a rib at work. So Rader gave him a pillow to lay on.
Oh, what a nice guy.
He covered Joseph Sr.'s head with a plastic bag that he secured with rope, only for him to chew through the bag. Okay. Rader attempted to murder Julie with a rope, but she regained consciousness and begged him to spare her children. This prompted Rader to kill her. Learning from his mistakes, he placed a plastic bag, 2 T-shirts, and an additional bag over Joey Jr.'s head and sat and watched while he struggled. With 3 family members murdered, Rader set his sights on Josephine, who was 11. He undressed the girl, tied a noose around a pipe in the basement, and asked if the family had a camera. They didn't, so Rader hung the girl and pleasured himself as she struggled against the rope. He then stole the family's car, and only to realize that he had dropped a knife in their backyard. So he dropped off the car, took his car back to the crime scene, and recovered the knife. With his first murder turning into 4, Rader had developed a plan he referred to as Project Lights Out. He had seen 21-year-old Catherine Bright entering her home with a friend. It was evident that Rader was not as observant as he thought he was, because he didn't realize that she lived with her brother, Kevin. This would have caused Dennis to steer clear because his goal was to stay away from the males as much as possible to make the killings easier.
Okay.
Just 3 months after his first set of murders, Rader broke into Bright's home through a sliding glass door. He swept up the glass so that there would be no suspicion, because having no door isn't suspicious at all. So she arrived home. His gun had misfired at one point, and he was worried that the smell of the gunpowder would raise suspicions.
Yeah.
She got home, and she wasn't alone. Her brother Kevin was with her. He told the pair a similar lie that he had told the Oteros. He told them that he was wanted from California and that he was there to get food and money. He forced the siblings into a room where he made Kevin bind her, and then he bound Kevin himself in a separate room. He had learned a trick from a detective magazine, and he was blasting music to drown out the sounds of struggle.
Of course he did.
When he returned to Kevin with the goal of strangling him, he realized that he was not good at binding people, and Kevin had actually gotten out.
Okay.
He pulled out his gun and shot Kevin in the forehead. He attempted to strangle Kevin, and then 2 more shots were fired. They hit him in the face again, and then one just barely grazed him. Kevin played dead and ran from the house to flag down a neighbor and call the police.
Okay.
Catherine asked about the gunshots and was told that her brother was dead, which caused her to fight back. Her resistance made it impossible for Rader to strangle her. So he tried to stab her instead. He stabbed her multiple times in the rib cage, and then he stole her vehicle, but he wasn't able to get the car started. It was a truck, and he just couldn't figure it out. So when the police, so he took his own car that he had parked at WSU.
Gotcha.
So she was alive when they found her, and she was actually holding a phone. She unfortunately died during surgery, but Kevin was able to give a description of their attacker. There were multiple cool-down periods during Rader's reign of terror in the Midwest. He would often dress in women's clothing and take photos of himself bound in a mask. You can actually find these online. I don't recommend looking at them because they're really, really weird.
I'm going to pass on that. Hard pass.
I think that's a good plan. I am upset that I had to see those while doing the research for this. So following this murder of Catherine Bright, Rader went radio silent for 3 years.
Okay.
In March of 1977, he had chosen a victim after stalking her, but she wasn't home that night. So he decided that he would find a random victim and came across Steve Relford.
Okay.
He was a 6-year-old boy, and he showed him a photo of his wife and daughter, and the boy accidentally identified them as his mother and sister. So he took them back to his house. He asked the boy's mother, Sherry Vianne Relford, if she could identify the photo, and he pulled a gun on her. He claimed once again that he wanted what he was wanted, and that he forced his way into their home.
Right.
He attempted to tie up Shirley's 3 children, but they were struggling far too much, and he forced them into a bathroom instead and made Shirley barricade the door. Rader said that he gave the children toys and supplies to keep them comfortable and threatened to shoot them if they broke free. He took Shirley to the back bedroom where she vomited from the stress of everything. He tied her to a bedpost, and she asked him for water, which because she was feeling sick.
Right.
And so he actually provided this water to her.
Wow. So this guy actually does some nice things, but he's just a terrible person.
Yeah, he's just awful. So he then placed a plastic bag over her head and strangled her. He said that he intended to murder the children, but a phone call actually went off, and one of the children screamed from the bathroom, "We have someone coming over," and that caused him to flee.
Wow.
During this time period, Rader was craving attention, so he reached out to Cake TV, a local news source, explaining his part in the murders. He had even chosen a list of possible monikers like the Wichita Phantom, the Poetic Strangler, the Asphyxiator, the Garrote Phantom, and the Wichita Hangman, and of course the BTK Killer.
Right.
He wrote a second letter asking, "How many people do I have to kill before I get a name in the paper or some national attention?" He had also enclosed a poem he called Ode Death to Nancy, which was based on the folk song Oh Death, and contained several spelling errors.
Of course it does.
So here's like a brief excerpt. I'm not going to read the whole thing because it's horrific. I'll stuff your jaws till you can't talk. I'll bind your legs till you can't walk. I'll tie your hands till you can't make a stand. And finally, I'll close your eyes so you can see. I'll bring sexual death upon you for me. He claimed to have something called the X Factor, which he claimed many serial killers like the Hillside Stranglers, Son of Sam, that's David Berkowitz, and Jack the Ripper also possessed this factor X. He asked the police to give him cryptic messages and subliminal messages, and when Cake delivered, it was unsuccessful. So he didn't even catch the cryptic message. So in 1979, he attempted to kill 63-year-old Anna Williams, who once again evaded him by not returning home. She was a little too late, so he left. In 1985, he had begun stalking a neighbor, Marianne Hodge. This was referred to as Project Cookie. He was at a Cub Scout meeting from that night of her murder and feigned a headache from the weather. It was nasty out, muddy, and he was like, I have a headache. So he went to a bowling alley on 21st and Woodlawn and swished some beer around his mouth, poured some on himself, and called a taxi. He pretended to be drunk and was dropped off one street down from his home, which was the same street that she lived on. He cut the phone lines, broke into the house, and waited in a closet. She actually came home with her boyfriend, so Rader waited them out. He drove her to his church, bound her, strangled her, and took photos. When daylight began to break, he cleaned up the scene, put her body in the trunk of his car, and threw her into a ditch. Project Dogside was used for the stalking and murder of Dolores Davis because she had a dog kennels near her home. Of course. He continually cased her house but was unable to find a way to break in. In January of 1991, Rader used a Trapper Scout meeting as an alibi. They were having their annual dead of night winter camp where he set up camp, fabricated a story that allowed him to leave, changed out of his uniform, and headed to the Davis residence. It was incredibly cold that evening. Kansas gets really cold. And Rader became impatient, so he broke through the screen door with a cinder block. She heard this and she fled from her room screaming, and he used his wanted man line on her again. He ended up tying her up with a pair of pantyhose and pretended to search for food in her kitchen while she begged for her life. Davis had lied and said that someone was coming home, so he strangled her and fled. So he didn't get to take his pictures like he was used to doing. He put her body in the trunk of her car, drove down to K. Lake, which is kind of a big deal in the area. It's a man-made lake. And he dumped her in the bushes. He returned her home when he threw her keys on the roof. He had heard somewhere that the police had looked for the Otero's keys on the roof, and he wanted to make a clear connection between this murder and those. So he got in his own car, returned to the body, and loaded her into his trunk, and he dumped her underneath the bridge. He then returned to the campsite before anyone had noticed he was gone. There are several other murders that may be connected to Rader from his time with the Scouts in Oklahoma and Missouri. But Rader denied these connections, and it's believed that's because Oklahoma had the death penalty. So he didn't want to fall into that trap.
No, of course
not. The BTK case was considered closed in 2004, but a book was actually being published, and they were giving the credit to a different man. And this prompted BTK to reach out to Cake and the Wichita Eagle. They received multiple communications with names like Bill Thomas Kilman, BTK, with ID cards and photographs from Vicki Wegerly. Her case had not initially been connected to BTK, but the Wichita Police Department's BTK unit, who called themselves the Hot Dog Squad, so they started testing this DNA that they found under her fingernails. They had a court order that they had like 1,300 DNA samples that they tested this against, but they actually had to destroy all of this because it was considered unethical. He continued to leave packages in various places like the public library with more confusing material. He wrote several letters to the police and asked if a floppy disk could be traced or not. The police responded in the Eagle saying that it would be safe to use the disk. And they were actually able to pull the metadata from the disk and found the Christ Lutheran Church where Rader was the president. They had seen a black Jeep Cherokee on surveillance footage at a Home Depot where he had dropped one of his weird packages, and they actually just went past his house and saw the vehicle in the driveway.
So crazy.
So all of this evidence was circumstantial at best. Like, they didn't have anything to actually connect him to these crimes. So they actually got a warrant for his daughter's pap smear and compared the DNA to the DNA they found under the fingertips, and it was actually a familial DNA.
Oh, wow.
So Dennis Rader was arrested on February 25th, 2005. He was charged with 10 counts of first-degree murder, and his bail was set at $10 million. He was appointed representation because he couldn't afford it. He denied not speak about at all at his arraignment, and they entered a plea of not guilty. His charge actually changed to guilty. He divulged the details of his crimes to the court and made no apologies. He was sentenced to 10 consecutive life sentences with a minimum of 175 years. The death penalty was not enforced in Kansas at the time of the murders, so he was moved from Sedgwick County Correctional Facility to El Dorado Correctional Facility. That's where he remains today. He was diagnosed with narcissistic, obsessive-compulsive, and antisocial personality disorders. Several books and films have been based on the BTK Killer, including The Clove Hitch Killer, Mindhunter, and A Good Marriage by Stephen King. There have been claims that Dexter was modeled after the BTK Killer, with terms like dark passenger connecting to that factor X. And Dexter also had a long hiatus at the end of the series. There was actually a podcast produced called Monster BTK, which was made by Payne Lindsay and the team at KAKE, which were actually receiving these letters from BTK throughout his time. And so that's actually from the real anchors, which was a really good podcast. They pronounce everything properly, which I appreciated.
That's always nice. And, you know, when we talk about BTK, and I was listening to you talk about him, and you wouldn't really know it by hearing about him, but you know, he was extremely violent, but not all psychopaths are. In fact, some are actually very successful.
True. It's been found that there are corporate psychopaths in leadership roles. So cool under pressure, charming, and manipulative. In fact, in leading professions for people with psychopathic traits is CEO and then lawyer.
Of course, of course. Lillefield's research in 2012 even linked psychopathic traits to heroic risk-taking in firefighters, rescue workers, police officers, etc. Right? My dad was a cop. He would have been number 7 on the list.
Think trauma surgeon, combat leaders, high-pressure negotiators. Low fear and emotional detachment can really be assets in these kind of things.
I think so. And you know, maybe your boss is a psychopath, and that's not always a bad thing, right? However, if your boss was Luis Garavito, you're probably going to want to find new employment. So La Bestia was summoned through a children's game, the Ouija board. The devil came to him and told him to kill that with killing many things may come. One of the most horrific and prolific killers in the world, he murdered nearly 193 young men and boys from 92 to 99. And as a young boy, he was neglected, right, physically abused by his father. He was often bullied by other children in school. He was removed from the school, actually, when he was in the 5th grade to help his family financially, so not much of an education. And he made claims that a family friend and phlebotomist molested him. He said the man bit, burned, and cut him. There is speculation that this story even holds any water from experts. After this alleged incident, he killed and dissected 2 birds, and then began to sexually molest his younger siblings. He also allegedly molested a 6-year-old boy in 1969. His family moved and then kept it a secret due to the fear that his family, might get in trouble. And quite frankly, they also didn't believe him 100%. Once they had settled, he was shown heterosexual pornography by a neighbor who laughed at his disgust and actually beat and then sexually assaulted him as a result. Now, this is around the time he started drinking. He was removed by his mother after attempting to sodomize a 5-year-old boy and later attempting to assault a 6-year-old boy. His father's response to all of this was reprimanding him for not sexually assaulting women instead. He was finally evicted for good because of his sexual preferences for men. He was violent in all aspects of his life. You know, he would lose jobs for starting fights with customers, coworkers, right? He was physically abusive to his girlfriends. He was called jealous, controlling, belittling. He was often the topic of town gossip and was repeatedly kicked out by his parents. He would often molest children while on breaks from work and began carrying razor blades, things like this, candles, lighters, to torture his victims, right? Or actually, he removed his own tooth so he could bite them more effectively. He kept a blue notebook with the names of his victims and used his Catholic faith to pray for them to absolve his sins.
Because that will work.
Right. Hey, look, I'm sorry. He began looking into the occult. He discovered Mein Kampf, which led to a deep admiration of Hitler, actually. Between 80 and 92, Garavito was estimated to have raped, tortured a minimum of 200 children, and they think it might be even up to 500 possibly. Many of these crimes were committed while he was under psychiatric care following reports of a suicide attempt. Anywhere Garavito lived, local reports of children molestation increased drastically. He kept mementos from his victims. Things like receipts, clothes, and identity cards were found, but the most devious trinket, children's toes. While most are aware he targeted young boys, it's less commonly known that he often selected victims based on their vulnerability, such as children from poor backgrounds, right? Those who were homeless, maybe in an orphanage, something like that. He would often bribe them with money, right? Candy, gifts, little odd jobs for them where they can make some cash. He had a real talent for drawing. He was actually an artist, and he would often use this skill as a means to kind of lure some of these children in, and sometimes sketching them even in public to gain their trust. And so like people would see this, and you're never going to expect, a guy that's drawing kids in public, to actually be a serial killer. There are also several cases where he would provide alcohol to the children in order to make them more pliant. He reportedly molested boys with cute faces. He liked children that seemed innocent looking. He had a fear of the dark, which actually led him to approach most of his victims in the broad daylight. He would often disguise himself as a Catholic priest, a school teacher, or like an elderly man, and he would be hunched over with a cane sometimes, right? And this was actually a really effective way of gaining, access to victims, kind of like Bundy would do. He would incorporate satanic rituals into his murders and use the children as blood sacrifices. Most of his victims were actually found in mass graves that he had dug, and then they found that they were killed with things like screwdrivers and blades and beatings and burns and bite marks. He enjoyed decapitating children. All of his victims had been sexually assaulted and were found completely naked. There was evidence of necrophilia and prolonged torture. And since Garavito moved frequently, it was difficult for the police to really investigate, right? There had been decades-long civil war, and it was really hard to find missing people as a result. In 1998, a skeleton was found, and days later, a mass grave with 36 children, mostly boys, with signs of binding, sexual assault, prolonged torture. And initially, the brutality and the sheer amount of bodies led them to believe that like a satanic cult or something was responsible for this, maybe a trafficking ring or something. But on February 6, 1999, outside of his hometown, 2 naked children were found, bound, and had signs of significant abuse. Just feet away, they discovered another body. The murder weapon was quickly located. Garavito had passed out, half-dressed on top of a child's corpse, drunk, with a cigarette in his hand, which had caused the sugarcane field to catch fire. He had burnt himself, left his money, burnt glasses, most of his clothing behind. They had also found the address to his girlfriend. The glasses suggested an astigmatism, and the shoes found showed the perpetrator walked with a limp. They initially arrested a different pedophile, but then, when the murders kept happening around Bogota, Graciela was contacted, his girlfriend. And she had said that she had not seen Garavito in months, but handed over a black suitcase that he had left behind, which contained a bunch of journals of his murders, tallies of his victims, and pictures of these boys. Now, his capture was partly due to a stroke of luck. He was arrested for attempting to rape a boy, unaware that the authorities were already investigating the serial killings that would later be linked to him. A homeless 16-year-old heard the struggle and began to throw stones. He chased the boy, but both were able to flee. A 12-year-old girl was aggressively asked for directions, and she sent him to the woods, where he became lost. By then, the police were actually searching for him and found him lost and wandering the forest. They were able to use his DNA found on the victims, a mandatory eye exam for all prisoners, and a 12-hour interrogation to finally secure his arrest. He was found guilty of 138 out of 172 accounts and was sentenced to 1,853 years and 9 days in prison.
Those 9 days really add up.
It put it over the top. Now, this is the lengthiest sentence in Colombian history, and what's interesting is they actually didn't have the death penalty the year that he was caught, and so he didn't receive the death penalty. Colombian law, however, then said you can only serve in prison for 40 years. And because he'd been willing to help find some of the bodies, they then lowered it to another 22 years. He was held separately in prison because it was almost certain that the other inmates would probably murder him for his crimes, and a judge blocked a request for early release because of good behavior in 2021. He became eligible for parole in 2023, but while in prison, he had a severe eye cancer and leukemia, which left him blind and required daily blood transfusions.
Oh, no.
Yeah. While in prison, he was diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder and has narcissistic personality traits as well. People were outraged that he could potentially face release, but some higher power ensured that would not happen. He died on October 12th, 2023, right before being able to meet with the parole board.
I mean, that's pretty convenient.
Yeah, he actually said that he was really interested in becoming like a politician as well. And like, yeah, he wanted to get into politics to help kids, he said. He was saved, right? All right. Let's bring this home with a comparison of some of the most infamous killers in history and how psychopathy doesn't apply to all of them in the same way.
Okay, let's take Ted Bundy. He's often the textbook example of psychopathic killer. He was charismatic, manipulative, and emotionally detached. Bundy confessed to killing over 30 women, but the real number may be even higher than that. He lured victims by faking injuries or impersonating authority figures, then brutally assaulted and murdered them, sometimes returning to the corpses days later for necrophilic acts. What's key here is the cold calculation and the complete lack of remorse, hallmarks of high-functioning psychopaths.
Absolutely. Bundy didn't kill out of rage or delusion, right? I mean, he planned, he stalked, and executed with chilling precision. Now, compare that to someone like Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, right? I actually grew up in California right when he was sort of terrorizing LA, but Ramirez was disorganized, impulsive, and really driven by sadistic compulsions. He often broke into homes at random, raped, tortured, and mutilated his victims, sometimes carving pentagrams into their skin or on the walls. He claimed to be doing the devil's work. Now, this is less psychopathy and more psychosis, delusions, hallucinations, and a break from reality.
And then there's Eileen Wuornos, who murdered 7 men in Florida while working as a sex worker. Right. Her crimes were brutal, yes, but also chaotic, reactive, and emotionally charged. Her background was riddled with trauma, childhood abuse, homelessness, sexual exploitation. Right. Many forensic psychologists believe she exhibited borderline personality traits, including intense emotional instability and abandonment fears, not the calculated coldness of a classic psychopath.
Yeah, and that's key. Not all killers are psychopaths, right? I mean, we've talked about some today, but not all psychopaths also kill. Wuornos likely acted out of perceived threat or desperation. Ramirez acted under the influence of delusion. Bundy, he killed because he wanted to, and because he could, without guilt, without empathy.
Ed Kemper, known as the co-ed killer, brutally murdered 10 people, including his grandparents, mother, and several young women, between 1964 and 1973. He was 6'9", wow. An imposing stature, and was intimidating and calculated with his killings. Yeah. Kemper lived a double life, appearing as a friendly, intelligent individual, even socializing at the bar with local police officers who were unaware of his gruesome acts. His chilling confessions revealed a twisted mind driven by deep-seated rage and a desire for control, making his psychopathy a guise for normalcy.
Yeah, that was a big man. And it's important to differentiate motive from method. One killer might act from rage or delusion, right? Another from a place of emotional vacancy. Same brutality, different brain.
That's why profiling is so complex. The presence of violence doesn't equal psychopathy. It's the why and the how that actually matters.
Yeah, and understanding helps us to move beyond the myth of the born killer, right? Because psychopathy is a spectrum, and motive lives in the mind, not just the crime scene.
Let's flip the narrative. Can psychopathy be useful?
Yeah. In controlled environments, these traits can be life-saving. I mean, fearlessness, right? It helps in combat. Emotional detachment. This helps in things like, surgery. Cold logic, right? That helps in crisis decision-making.
A study in psychological science found that people with higher psychopathy scores made more rational decisions in high-stakes dilemmas.
Nice. And that's actually, really important, like during something like surgery, right?
Right. You need to be able to make those split-second decisions that could be life or death without having any guilt, I guess.
Useful, maybe. But you probably don't want to marry a psychopath. All right. So time to get a little personal. We've talked about what makes a psychopath, but what about us? We took the Hare Psychopathy Checklist Revised, or the PCLR, and we've got our own scores.
And no, this time it isn't some BuzzFeed quiz. It's a good standard forensic tool used by criminal psychologists, developed by Dr. Robert Hare. The checklist is made up of 20 items, each scored 0, 1, or 2, depending on how well that trait applies.
Yeah, and so the maximum score is going to be a 40, and generally a score of about 30 to 40, right? 30 or higher is the clinical cutoff for psychopathy in North America. Most people score in the single digits, unless you're hosting a true crime podcast, apparently.
Mike, you scored an 18, which is like pretty high for a non-criminal.
Yeah, not proud, but let's break it down so listeners know what that means. Like, I'm not a complete freak. The checklist is split into two main factors. Factor one is the interpersonal affective traits, right? This is like the personality side, the charm, the manipulation, the lack of empathy.
So these are going to be things like glibness, superficial charm, grandiose sense of self, pathological lying, manipulativeness, lack of remorse or guilt.
Yep.
You're going to have a shallow affect. You're going to be kind of callow and lack that empathy. And there's going to be a failure to accept responsibility.
Yeah, this is where I got dinged. I scored points for charm, manipulativeness, and a little grandiosity. I mean, I am hosting a podcast, let's be honest. But I did score low on the lack of remorse and lack of empathy stuff. So I might talk slick, but I cry at dog movies.
This seems like a justification for your actions.
Maybe.
I scored low across the board here. I'm empathetic, I over-apologize, and I actually feel too much. So sometimes classic overthinker energy is what I'm giving. So my total was actually a 7.
Oh, nice. Okay, on the behavioral side, so lifestyle antisocial traits, right? There's stuff like impulsivity, irresponsibility, criminal behavior. These include things like need for stimulation, prone to boredom, parasitic lifestyle, lack of realistic long-term goals, impulsivity, irresponsibility, right? Poor behavioral controls, early behavior problems, juvenile delinquency, revocation of conditional releases, criminal versatility.
Is this where you picked up more points?
Yeah, I got marked for impulsivity, need for stimulation, and a history of sketchy teen behavior. I may or may not have stolen a stop sign once, but I was in college. Like, don't we all do stupid crap in college?
I feel like that's like just part of it.
But no criminal versatility. I've never ever even gotten a speeding ticket. So like I had these issues when I was younger, and I kind of grew out of it.
I scored a little bit higher here too. I've definitely been more impulsive, maybe a little reckless in my younger 20s, but I've never lived a parasitic lifestyle or been in legal trouble. So I landed a total of 7 overall, which is average for civilians and still very much an empathetic human being range.
Yeah. So are we psychopaths? Short answer, no. I'm at 18, which puts me on the elevated traits end, but still under the clinical outcome and cutoff of 30, right? Think of it like being on a psychopathy spectrum, not dangerous, just, I don't know, let's say high-functioning spicy. Now, on the other hand, a score of 7 means you might occasionally steal the last slice of pizza, but you're probably not plotting world domination yet.
Yet being the operative word here. So today we're diving into what exactly a score of 7 means.
So a 7 means you're more of a quirky character than Hannibal Lecter, say. Bottom line, psychopathy is not binary. It's not you are or you aren't. It's a spectrum of traits. And honestly, some of those traits like charm, confidence, risk tolerance can be adaptive in small doses.
Okay, that's good to know. But let's break it down for our listeners. A score of 7 might include traits like being a little impulsive or charmingly manipulative, but in a fun way, right?
True.
But when you add callousness, a lack of remorse, and antisocial behavior, that's when it kind of crosses into that dangerous territory.
Yeah, so if you're listening and wondering how you'd score, you know, if you care if you're a psychopath or not, you're probably not. But if you want to find out, take the checklist.
So what do you think? Should we screen for psychopathy in boardrooms, schools?
Can empathy be taught or even engineered?
Drop your thoughts in the YouTube comments or DM us on socials. We really want to hear from you.
If this episode gave you chills or a weird amount of clarity, don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share with someone who maybe enjoys being a little too fearless.
And next week, we're shifting gears and talking about vaping, how the psychology of addiction, marketing, and misinformation is putting a generation at risk. Until then, stay curious, stay kind,
and keep planting thoughts.